But I remember being in a hospital when news came on the television that the Ceaușescus had been captured and, in fact, killed. They showed pictures of Nicolae and Yelena Ceaușescu lying in the snow dead. And the medical staff and the patients all erupted in ecstasy. They cheered to the echo as though they were watching some football match and their team had scored. And it was a very striking moment, and you got a real sense of how hated these two had been.
This is Cold War Conversations, and if you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand accounts of the Cold War. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. Allan Little recounts his journey from his student days in Edinburgh to working as a journalist on the front lines of Cold War history in Eastern Europe and beyond. In 1989, he found himself on the night shift at the BBC in London when the Berlin Wall fell. Witnessing the world change in real time, Allan's desire to be part of these monumental events grew stronger. He shares his experience as a journalist during the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Allan describes the electrifying atmosphere of Wenceslas Square and the fear of a violent crackdown. Allan also takes us to Romania during the fall of Nicolae Ceaușescu's brutal regime. He recounts in detail the chaos, the gunfire and the bloody reality of the revolution's human cost. The episode also delves into his time during the 1991 Gulf War in Baghdad. He describes the eerie experience of watching the city being bombed from his hotel room and the resilience of the people around him. As the episode draws to a close, Allan reminds us that while we may know what a society is transitioning from, we should be cautious in predicting what it's transitioning to. I'm delighted to welcome Allan Little to our Cold War conversation.
I was a student in Edinburgh in the early 80s, and I was writing an essay in my room, and my flatmate knocked on the door, put his head round the door and said, "There's been a military coup in Poland." And I was instantly on sort of red alert. I thought, my goodness, a military coup in Europe in this day and age. We had a little black and white TV at the time, and I used to watch this guy every evening on the tea time news. He'd been a stringer in Warsaw, a BBC stringer, completely unknown until this moment. But because the Poles, the Jaruzelski regime, sealed the borders, nobody could get in. And this guy called Tim Sebastian was the BBC stringer resident in Warsaw, and he was there, and it kind of made his name because he was on every night suddenly. And I remember thinking, God, what must it be like to be him? Imagine having that front row seat in witnessing the theatre of history unfold. Imagine being in Poland when there's a military clampdown. And I remember being very excited about the prospect of being present as history is made, and that sort of galvanized me into trying to get into journalism.
What was that path for you into journalism? I can't imagine you see many adverts for foreign correspondent knocking around.
No, I always tell young journalists that the hardest part of their career is going to be the start. Getting in is so competitive. I got a lucky break. I got offered a 3-month contract at BBC Scotland straight out of university just to bash the phones. And so I spent 6 months in the BBC Scotland newsroom. And then I got on a training course in London to train to be a radio reporter. And I spent a couple of years in local radio in England, in Southampton. And then I got an attachment to the Today programme. Again, a 3-month attachment to Today, and then they extended it for 3 months, and then they made it permanent, or as permanent as jobs were back then, a year's contract. And it was during my time at the Today programme, about 9 months after I joined on attachment, things started to move in Eastern Europe. The 1989 revolution started to take off, and I was desperate to get in on the act, but I was too junior, and they wouldn't send me. And then the Berlin Wall fell. I was on a night shift the night the Berlin Wall came down. And I'd been to Prague. To believe it or not, I'd actually been to Prague the previous year to watch a football match. Hearts were playing in the UEFA Cup, and I'd spent about 5 or 6 days there, and pretending to be a Hearts supporter got me a visa, and I was able to go and spend some time, in a country that was really hard to spend any time in as a tourist. And so I sort of knew a few people in Prague, and I started badgering my editor to let me go to Prague. And then finally there was that student demonstration on, I think it was the 17th of November, which ended up with the police clamping down and rumours of people being killed, which proved to be not true. But then that started the demonstrations in what was then Czechoslovakia. And my editor then rang me and said, get yourself a visa and get on a plane, go. So I got to Prague sometime in the week beginning the 20th of November, I think it was, and attended those massive demonstrations on Wenceslas Square and started talking to people who were demonstrating to try and bring down the communist regime. But the communist regime in Czechoslovakia was considered one of the more hardline ones in Eastern Europe at that time. And people were still talking about a kind of Tiananmen Square type resolution to this in Prague. People were genuinely frightened that there would be a very violent crackdown by the communist regime.
Indeed. I've a similar story from me. I saw Rangers against Dukla Prague in 1981 in Prague. Not being a Rangers fan, I happened to be there on holiday, and the tour guide said, I can get you a ticket for this game. That was quite interesting, as Dukla was a military club.
That's right. It was Dukla Prague that Hearts were playing in the second round of the UEFA Cup, and I went with a couple of friends who were genuine Hearts fans, and we drove from London across Europe and crossed the border in West Germany, and drove up to Prague that way. And I remember being very excited to be on the other side of the Iron Curtain.
Wow, yeah, that must have been some journey. What preparation did the BBC give you for being a foreign correspondent, if any?
I suppose almost none, but I was already an experienced radio reporter, so I knew how to tell a story on the radio. But no, they didn't groom me in any traditional sense to be a foreign correspondent. They just sent me on this assignment, which, I mean, nobody expected this to happen in Eastern Europe, and it all started to take off, that, if you remember, that summer. Remember, this is a pre-digital age. There's no internet to look up, no mobile phones or anything like that. And there was a department called News Information in the old broadcasting house, and you went to News Information and said, give me everything you've got on Czechoslovakia. And they had a very small file of newspaper clippings, because almost nobody had done any reporting from Czechoslovakia for years. They photocopied about, I don't know, a couple of dozen newspaper cuttings. I remember there was a lovely feature by Joan Bakewell. She'd been allowed to get into Prague about 10 years previously, and she'd written a piece about Bohemia. And so you landed at the airport with your visa and got in a taxi and said, take me to the revolution. The taxi driver would say, oh, there are some students making placards in Charles University. I'll drop you there. So it was seat of the pants stuff.
Wow. And did you have any challenges with the language? Were you finding English speakers who could tell you what was going on?
This was my first real foreign assignment. I'd been given day trips to Berlin and Spain before, but this is my first foreign assignment in which there was a moving news story. I was learning how to operate on the job. So I was concentrating on finding people who could speak English. And then after a few days, I met this young medical student. He was in the third year of his medical degree at Charles University, and he spoke pretty good English, and he agreed to come and work with me as a translator. So I was then able to speak to people who didn't speak any English, and that opened a lot of doors for me. And I'm still in touch with him. He became a friend. We spent weeks together, and we've stayed in touch all these years.
Wow. And what sort of feeling were you getting from people?
Stressful. Some people were quite reluctant to speak. They were still scared. They were still trying to work out what was happening. The medical student I hooked up with, he said to me, when I sit my final exams at the end of fifth year, I'll have to pass 5 exams. They are medicine, hygiene, obstetrics and gynecology, surgery, and Marxism-Leninism. So I said, wait a minute, 20% of your intellectual effort has got to be devoted to this sort of 19th century philosophical cul-de-sac in the European tradition. And he said, yep, we've got to do that. So I said, is there a professor of Marxism-Leninism in the medical faculty? He said, yes, there is. Do you want to go and meet her? So we went to this woman's office. She taught Marxism-Leninism to medical students. And we sat in her office, and we could hear the sounds of the revolution coming up from the street below through the open window. And I remember saying to her, so you're a high priestess of this religion that's being torn down as we speak. Do you even believe in its credo? And she said to me, look, and she was a woman in her, I would say, late 50s. She said, look, those of us who lived through 1938, 1948, 1968, we know better than to ask that question. We do our jobs, we keep our heads down, we go out at the weekend with our family, and we have a good private life. And it was my first encounter with what I understood came to be known as internal exile, where the sort of educated urban middle classes in Eastern Europe simply retreated from the public square, retreated from any kind of participation in public discourse, and just opted to have as happy a life as they could in the restricted atmosphere, because to do anything else was too dangerous. You ended up in jail like Havel, I suppose, and other dissidents, or you ended up not being allowed to work at your chosen profession for which you were qualified. I mean, all those educated people who ended up as window cleaners and construction workers because they had spoken out against the regime in 1968, including Marta Kubišová, the so-called Czech nightingale, the folk singer who came to prominence in 1968. She disappeared after 1968, after the Soviet invasion, and was never heard of again until one afternoon at 4:00 in Wenceslas Square, she appeared on the balcony with Václav Havel and sang the Czechoslovak national anthem. And people all around me, I was standing maybe 30 meters away in a crowd of 400,000, and everybody knew exactly who she was, even though her name had not appeared in any publication, on the radio, on television, anywhere for 21 years. People still knew exactly who she was and what she symbolized, what she represented.
Well, I think she had a famous song. I seem to remember seeing footage of her singing.
Yeah, I first heard of her when I met a young woman called Blanca, and she also worked for me as a translator, and she took me home to her parents' flat, where she and her brother lived with their parents in a little flat, and her father told me, and this was when it was safe to speak, this was after the regime, the Politburo announced it was resigning, and that everybody knew that it was a matter of time before Havel was sworn in as president. And her father told me that he'd listened to the Czech service of the BBC World Service, and they used to do a program every evening for 15 minutes. It was the Czechoslovak service, and he would listen very quietly with the shortwave radio up against his ears, just in case if he listened at a normal volume, he was afraid his neighbours might hear and report him. And the BBC and the censors in the country used to play cat and mouse with each other, because the Czech regime would jam the signal and the BBC would change the frequency, and then after a few days the Czechs would catch up with that and jam that signal, and then they would move this frequency again. So he described how he'd have to move around the dial till he found the program. And he took me to a cupboard under the stairs, a kind of walk-in cupboard in which there was this amazing archive from 1968. It was a kind of alternative history of the country. So there were magazines and books and newspaper cuttings and photographs and records, songs, including songs by the Czech nightingale, Marta Kubišová. And it was a kind of alternative history of the country, an archive documenting his version of the history of the country. And he said to his kids at school, study the official history, pass the exams, because you'll need all that, but it's all lies. And here's the real history of our country, which I'm keeping privately and secretly. You must never tell anybody that we've got this, because it's dangerous and seditious. But it was safe now for him to show me that. And it was an amazing example of how ordinary people kept alive a history that contradicted the platitudes and truisms of the communist regime.
Yeah, because after 1968, Czechoslovakia went under that period of so-called normalization, and all those memories had to be suppressed until 1989. And as you've outlined, I mean, the bravery of people like Havel to actually stick their heads above the parapet, and, you know, all the signatories of Charter 77 is incredible, because, you know, if you were living in Czechoslovakia at that time, as you've illustrated, you don't know that this regime is going to disappear in 1989. So therefore, what do? Do you keep your head down, like some people did, and as you've described, or do you actually stick your head above the parapet and protest and take the consequences?
Yeah, I met a man called Václav Mali, who was a priest, and he had spent years in jail, and he was very quiet and very reserved, but absolutely steely in his determination to, as Havel put it, live in truth. And he was another one who'd spent time. And Havel himself had been in jail as recently as April. And by December, he was president in Hradčany Castle. And there was something apt about, in in Bohemia, in Czechoslovakia, about a revolution led by a theatre director and a playwright. There was something highly theatrical something quite performative about the way in which the Czechoslovak regime collapsed and was brought down. And I remember Havel gave daily press conferences in a theatre called the Magic Lantern. And, you could tell there was something quite artistic about the aspiration, and it embraced the working class as well. I remember the regime denounced the revolution led by a theatre director and supported by students as bourgeois counter-revolutionaries, and called on the working class to come out in support of socialism. Havel called on the working class to down tools one day and said, let's have a symbolic strike of 2 hours, 12 noon till 2 p.m. I think the following Monday. I and the medical student, Vojen, I was working with, we drove out to a town called Kladno, north of Prague. It was then a huge steel town, one of the biggest steel plants in Europe. And it had been in the late 40s and 50s a sort of bedrock of heartland of communism and communist activism. It was written up as a sort of hero city in the official history of the country. And the regime talked about the red glow of Kladno because, of course, the steel plant would glow red, cast a red light in the night sky. And this was symbolic of its sort of socialist solidarity. So we went out to Kladno and we went to the gates of the steel plant and waited, and went bang on the stroke of noon. The doors opened and the workers all marched out in file, thousands and thousands of them, carrying banners in support of the revolution. And I remember one of them said, plurality, not brutality, which also rhymes in Czech. And another banner that said, the bourgeois reactionary students are our children. It was profoundly moving. And you sort of knew at that moment that it was over for the communist regime, which had become obviously corrupt and detested and hated by almost everybody.
You mentioned Marta Kubišová before, but there was another face from 1968 who appeared next to Havel in Wenceslas Square.
That's right. It was the same day as Marta Kubišová was there. We came out of the tube station and there were 400,000 people in the square, the organisers reckoned, and the balcony was on, I think, the second floor of a building that housed a newspaper called Svobodné slovo, which means free words. And this was a newspaper that was published by the small Socialist Party. I think, it was the Socialist Party, and it was one of the parties that was a kind of front party it was controlled by the Communist Party, obviously, but to show that the Communist Party were in coalition with other parties. And Svobodné slovo had broken ranks with the communists early on and were publishing anti-communist editorials and stories in the newspaper. And I remember going there at midnight each night, and the crowds would gather and they would throw copies of tomorrow morning's paper from the balconies onto the streets, and people would eagerly scoop these up to read the latest anti-communist stories. And so they allowed Havel to speak from the balcony each afternoon at 4:00. Blanca and I emerged from the metro station about 20 meters from the balcony, and absolutely crowded with people. We couldn't move. People were standing shoulder to shoulder. It was cold, and everybody had big coats on, and there was a gentle fall of snow. And suddenly Havel appeared on the balcony with Marta Kubišová and an old man, a white-haired old man. And everybody kind of gasped. I know what it's like to hear 400,000 people gasp in disbelief at the same time. And I said to Blanca, what is it? She said, oh my God, I can't believe it. It's him. It's Dubček. It's Alexander Dubček. And there he was, this old man. And what I couldn't understand was how Blanca, who was 21 years old, how she recognized him, because he had disappeared from public view 21 years earlier, the year she was born.
Alexander Dubček was the first secretary of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia and effectively the leader of Czechoslovakia from January 1968 to April 1969. He oversaw significant reforms to the communist system during a period that became known as the Prague Spring, but his reforms were reversed and he was eventually sidelined following the Warsaw Pact invasion in August 1968. For more information, see episodes 14 and 17.
And I wondered how many 21-year-olds in Britain could identify Harold Wilson, who was Prime Minister. His image hadn't been banned. And it was because of this archive under the stairs in her parents' home that she knew exactly who he was. And he spoke from the balcony, and it was absolutely electrifying because he approached the microphone and people were holding their breath in anticipation. And the first word he said in public in 21 years was not an abstract noun like freedom or democracy or liberty or liberation. It was the name of the country, in the vocative case, Czechoslovakia, and he said it very slowly, and each syllable kind of rolled up and down the square and bounced off the high 19th century buildings on each side of the square and echoed up and down, and it was absolutely breathtaking. It was like watching a magician bestow liberation with the uttering of a kind of magic spell. And you sort of knew at that moment that it was all over. And of course, Dubček himself went on to become, I think, Speaker of Parliament in the new dispensation. And at the time, I didn't think very much of the fact that it was the name of the nation that so electrified people. But Marta Kubišova, a few minutes later, the song she chose to sing was the national anthem, not a hymn of liberty or democracy. And I came to understand much later that at the time I thought of it as a sort of anti-communist, pro-democracy uprising, but it was also a moment of national liberation. And I don't think I fully appreciated how much the idea of national liberation from a hated foreign occupation was a powerful motivating factor. I think I reported it at the time as essentially a pro-democracy uprising. But in fact, what we were witnessing in real time was the much delayed end of the Second World War and the reunification of a partitioned continent. And I think I would come to understand the power of that a few years later in former Yugoslavia, where I would see the call of the tribe, the call of the nation. In hindsight, it taught me a lesson that quite often as journalists watching events unfold in real time, we know what a nation or a society is in transition from, but we should be very careful when making judgments about what we think it's in transition to. So we thought at the time that Eastern Europe countries of the Warsaw Pact were in transition from communism and Soviet occupation and in transition to Western European-style liberal democracy. Well, it turned out that the situation was a bit more complicated than that. And what we've seen in the last decade or so is, in many of these former communist countries, the rejection of Western European ideals and models of liberal democracy in favor of what Orban, for example, calls illiberal democracy. And so I think in 1989 we might have been a little too quick to make our assessment what the countries were in transition to.
The description you gave of Dubček appearing on the balcony and the other descriptions there are so evocative, and I think it can be difficult to remember how earth-shattering these events were. You know, I remember at the time thinking the Soviet Union is going to be there forever, and that's just the way it's going to be. And yet within the passage of a few months and years, the whole of that structure had been swept away.
Yes, I remember thinking that day when Dubček appeared, I remember thinking even at the time that this is one of those pivotal years in history. And I thought to myself, how many years have carried this significance of historical change since the French Revolution? And I thought, okay, 1789, 1815, you can make a case for 1848, 1870, 1919, 1945. 6. This is the 7th. And I'm watching it in real time as a young reporter. 6 or 7 dates in the history of Europe since the French Revolution have been as weighty and as important as this. You could even narrow that down to 4 or 5. So it was a huge privilege to be there. And for me, it was my first big assignment. And it doesn't get any better than that in terms of the idea, the privilege we have as journalists sometimes of stumbling into a situation where we are there watching in real time as history turns.
Amazing times, amazing times.
And I went down to Bratislava because they announced that the border to Austria was going to be opened for the first time, I think, since 1948. And what I hadn't understood was that in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of course, Bratislava was only 25 miles from Vienna. And at one time, it even had a German name. And people had a living memory of before 1948 of being able to take a tram or a train into Vienna from Bratislava to watch the opera and go home in the same evening. And then this curtain descended, and Bratislava and Slovakia generally were cut off from the imperial capital, which had been such an important part of the identity and civic life of Bratislava. And they were going to open the border for the first time at midnight. So I went down to watch people gathering for the symbolic opening and crossing into Austria for the first time, being allowed to cross into Austria for the first time. It was a kind of mini version of what had happened at the Berlin Wall on November the 9th. So this was about 3 weeks later. And that was an important symbolic moment as well. And again, I saw in it the reunification of a continent that had been partitioned at the end of the Second World War.
Amazing times, amazing times.
I remember thinking on the border there between Bratislava and between Slovakia and Austria, I remember waking up to what I'd sort of subconsciously known about Central Europe, which was that it had been for many generations a kind of polyglot, polycultural melting pot. And there was Prague in the 19th century, for example, was a German-speaking city. Franz Kafka lived in Prague. He was a German speaker. And most people would have been at least bilingual, if not trilingual. When the emperor put out a proclamation, it had to be put out in 14 or 15 languages. And there was still just about a folk memory of that tradition. And there was a story about census takers in Bohemia asking people, are you German or Czech? And the answer would be yes. I am Czech, depending on the continent in which I find myself. When I'm in the countryside growing my cabbages, I'm Czech. When I'm in the city selling them, I'm German. So people were used to living in a multicultural, multilinguistic world. There's a very moving scene in Joseph Roth's Radetzky March, the novel, where a young soldier saves the life of the emperor almost by accident. The emperor grants him some land, and he becomes a member of the minor nobility. And he's a Slovene. He goes home to visit his father, who's a gardener, one of the emperor's estates. The father is so overwhelmed by his son being a member of the nobility, he feels he has to speak German to him. And it's a moment of great awkwardness and estrangement between the two men as the father speaks the language he thinks his son has been elevated into. And watching that exchange across the border was a reminder of that vanished world, that Central European melting pot. If you remember Otto von Bismarck, he was a member of the European Parliament, and he was the heir to the Bismarck dynasty. And Austria was playing Hungary at football. And somebody said to him, are you going to watch the Austria-Hungary game? And he said, who are we playing? So as a kind of joke. So that consciousness of that world that had pretty much disappeared between the wars came back into the European story, came back into popular consciousness, and I found that very fascinating. Not long after that stint in Czechoslovakia, I was parachuted into Romania just before Christmas as things started to take off there. So Romania was the kind of hermit, well, Albania was the real hermit country, but Romania was a very closed country as well. It was a very, very brutal regime and known for that. And suddenly we heard rumors of popular demonstrations in Timișoara in the west of the country. Now, what I didn't really fully understand at the time was that the ethnicity was a big part of Romania's identity. And the demonstrations were being held in support of a Lutheran pastor called Laszlo Turkesh, and his name is Hungarian, of course. And there was a huge Hungarian minority in Western Romania, and also quite a big German-speaking population. And again, this ethnic patchwork in Romania was a reminder of how Europe had been divided up after the First World War, and Hungary had lost an awful lot of territory because it had fought on the wrong side of the war. It had lost the war, and huge parts of what many irredentists in Hungary believed to be naturally Hungarian territory were carved off and given to some of the other new states, including parts of Serbia in the north and Romania in the west. And so I was told to get on a plane to Belgrade in what was then Yugoslavia, get a car and drive to the Romanian border and try to get across. When I went to the Czechoslovakia, I had a visa and everything. I was legitimate, but there was no time to apply for a visa for Romania. And a colleague and I drove from Belgrade to a town called Vršac in Serbia on the border, and we checked into a hotel for the night, and at dawn we got up and they led us across the border. But the border guards were warning us to be careful. They didn't share a language, but they managed to indicate that there was gunfire. There was fighting on the road and in the town, and we got there and there was turmoil. There were demonstrations, the soldiers were everywhere. And I remember spending the night at the studios of Radio Timișoara, which had been taken over by the demonstrators. And the airwaves had been captured by the anti-regime uprising, and the Ceaușescus were still in power at this point. We didn't know that they'd tried to get away and had in fact been captured. What happened was, late at night, and it was dark, it was December, so it was very dark. I think it was Christmas Eve or the day before Christmas Eve. Suddenly the army burst into the radio station and told us all to get into a room in the middle of the building that had no exterior walls or windows, and they switched all the lights off and told us to lie on the floor. Suddenly there was a gun battle outside. Securitate, the army told us it was the Securitate trying to storm the building. The Securitate, the security police, had stayed loyal to the Ceaușescu regime because, of course, if the Ceaușescus fell, they would be in the firing line for the brutality they'd meted out in support of the Ceaușescu regime over the years. And they were trying to storm the building. So it was a very frightening few hours we spent there, thinking that if the Securitate get in here, they will come in with guns firing and we'll be in the way. So there was a standoff. The army defended the building. And I remember how exhausted they looked, how absolutely shattered all the soldiers looked. And we had to shelter there for the night until the battle was over. And then something very odd happened. The army started giving press conferences saying that 70,000 people had been killed by the Securitate during the uprising in Romania and 5,000 in Timișoara. And there was a young Polish journalist there who was a stringer for the Sunday Telegraph, and his name was Radek Sikorski. And he was very strikingly articulate and very strikingly clever. And he turned up to have been a schoolboy in Britain at the time of the 1981 clampdown in Poland, and therefore couldn't go back. And he spent the years of his teens and early 20s in Britain as a refugee. And he'd got this job as a stringer for the Sunday Telegraph, and he was highly skeptical. And he roused the skepticism of the press people, and he would say to the army spokesman, "If there are 5,000 dead in this city, can we see the bodies, please? Where are the bodies?" And he was invested in the anti-communist story. And if any of us was going to believe the stories of all these dead, Radek Sikorski had the motivation to believe it, but he was the one who led the challenge. It was very striking, very impressive. And we asked to see the bodies. And eventually they showed us a few bodies in a morgue. And most of them had surgery. These were people who had died in hospital from natural causes or from disease. And they couldn't show us any. There were some dead. I saw some myself, but not 5,000. And I remember thinking Timișoara is about the size of Edinburgh, which is where I'd gone to university. And I thought, if there were 5,000 people dead in Edinburgh, in a city of 500,000, I would know some of them personally, or I would know people who knew some of them. So we started to challenge the official narrative of the army spokespeople. But the headlines all said 70,000 people dead at the hands of the Ceaușescus, and it simply wasn't true. And what had happened in Romania, in contrast to Czechoslovakia, was a military coup. It wasn't really a popular revolution, although the coup was supported by the people, but it was really a military coup that had some popular legitimacy, but it was quite hard to understand exactly what was going on. But I remember being in a hospital talking to people about what was going on when news came on the television that the Ceaușescus had been captured and in fact killed. And they showed pictures of the dead. They didn't show the moment of the killing, but they showed pictures of Nicolae and Yelena Ceaușescu lying in the snow dead. And the medical staff and the patients all erupted in ecstasy. they cheered to the echo as though they were watching some football match and their team had scored. And it was a very striking moment, and you got a real sense of how hated these two had been.
I mean, that must have been a terrifying time for you, because this is your first time sort of where your life is really in danger in Timișoara.
Yeah, it was the first time I'd ever heard guns fired in anger. And I remember going into a schoolroom, which had been turned into a kind of field hospital. And I was completely blindsided by it. In retrospect now, I don't think I really knew how to operate in that situation. And there was a very exhausted doctor. He was quite an old man. He must have been well into his 60s. And he was trying to handle this himself. And he turned this schoolroom into a field hospital. And there was an Italian journalist there who'd been shot. And I was really shocked by that because, I thought I'm here to witness, not to suffer. And it makes you recalibrate. And there was a young man on a mattress, and he was about my age, late 20s. He was lying on a mattress, and there was a sort of waterproof tarpaulin on the mattress. He had a thick tube in his mouth down into his lungs, and he was naked from the waist up, and he was covered from the waist down. He was covered in a sheet, and he had clearly bled out. But the respirator was still going, and as his chest rose and fell to the rhythm of the respirator, I could see his elbow dip in and out of the blood that had pooled, his own blood that had pooled in the indentation made by the weight of his body in the mattress. And I remember even at the time thinking, he's dead. He's dead. And the staff haven't had time to do anything about it. And he's in a bloodbath. And I thought, gosh, this is a bloodbath. This is a literal bloodbath. We normally use that phrase metaphorically. And I've never, as far as I know, as far as I can remember, I've never used the phrase in any of my reporting since. Because early in my career, I saw a real one, a literal one. And it made a very profound impact on me.
Difficult to imagine that experience, but thank you for giving me that description. How long were you in Romania for? Were you just there for a few days, or did you get to Bucharest?
I didn't get to Bucharest. The BBC was well represented in Bucharest by much, much more senior people than me. I was there still working exclusively for the Today programme, so turning around, colourful radio packages with lots of people's voices in them. So we stayed in, and also it was very hard to file from Romania because the phones weren't working much very, very well or very reliably. So 2 or 3 times I drove from Timișoara back across the border to Varšas, where my producer had booked a hotel, and we were filing our stories from Serbia and then driving back in. And I remember it was really when I was only there a few days, maybe a week, and because the BBC by then had more senior people than me there. And I remember when we came out for the last time, we drove not back to Serbia, but to Hungary, to Budapest, which by now had its own anti-communist revolution and was at peace. And we checked into a 5-star hotel on the banks of the Danube. And it was the first time that I experienced that sense of elation, of having seen something profound and very dangerous and frightening, and of having survived and got out to safety. And it was a sensation I'd become familiar with in the years that lay ahead. But I remember the high of it, the elation and the relief and the sense of having accomplished something and done well professionally and of being alive and of feeling alive, feeling graphically and colourfully alive. And it was a sensation I'd become familiar with in the years that lay ahead, especially as the violence unfolded in former Yugoslavia.
So this makes you want to carry on and do more of this coverage?
Oh, definitely. I knew that I wanted my future to be in what we then called foreign news. I knew I wanted to try and get a posting and to live somewhere abroad. I've always been fascinated by the story of Europe anyway. I wanted to work in Europe. And I knew that I wanted to specialize in foreign news. And the following year, in August, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And a few weeks went past. And again, you have to remember that I was quite junior in the pecking order. I applied for a foreign job and didn't get it. But on the basis of the interview I'd done, the head of radio news told the foreign editor to try me out. And he rang me one day. I didn't know him. And I'd never met him. He rang me and said, come and see me. And he said, I want you to go to Baghdad to be the radio news guy on the ground in Baghdad. And he said, I'm not going to say this could be a dangerous assignment because, frankly speaking, it is a dangerous assignment. So think about it for a few hours. I want to know by 3:00 you're up for it. And of course I was up for it, but it was frightening. And I remember getting my visa and going to see the head of the Arabic service at the World Service to talk. I, didn't know anything about Iraq. I had to mug up as best I could about the nature of the regime, the nature of the invasion of Kuwait and the consequences of it and the Western response to that. There's a great line in an autobiography by the great foreign correspondent James Cameron when he was in the Korean War and he was in a little press boat during a seaborne invasion. And he says something like, we were all performatively determined to get ashore in wave 1 while secretly trying, in our privacy of our own heads, trying to contrive some not disreputable way of being in wave 50. So, and I completely get that you put on a brave face and you talk about the story, but then quietly you say, what do you think might happen if the war starts when I'm there? And the head of Arabic at the World Service said, oh, well, you're in a ship, mate. So I had no illusions about the nature of the assignment, but I wanted to go and it was frightening but exhilarating. And so off I went into Baghdad in the company of the great John Simpson, who was already a household name in foreign news at the time. He was the sort of grandfather of the broadcast foreign news. And I went in on his coattails, and that was another really turning point for me in terms of career.
And what was that experience like in Baghdad? Were you there before the bombing started?
I was there before the bombing in October for about 3 or 4 weeks, and it was an interesting time to be there because the Soviets and the French were trying to find a solution that wouldn't involve war. And Yevgeny Primakov was the Soviet foreign minister. He came a couple of times, and what the Iraqis were trying to do was divide Moscow and Paris off from London and Washington and split the international community, in the end unsuccessfully. But they were trying to do that. And I remember Edward Heath came. Edward Heath announced at the Conservative Party conference that he was going to fly to Baghdad. Margaret Thatcher was absolutely livid, reportedly. Going to fly to Baghdad to try to negotiate the release of some of the British hostages. Because if you remember, there were lots of Westerners living in Iraq, mostly because of the oil industry at the time of the invasion of Kuwait, and they weren't allowed to leave. They were being held, and that was my first encounter with the term human shield. They were being held in the end as human shield, and Edward Heath managed to get some of them released, but only a few dozen, and there were several hundred there. And so that was happening at the time. But then I left after about 3 or 4 weeks. In the new year, we were waiting for the war to start. I was sent to Jordan, to Amman, to wait there. And 2 of my colleagues from the BBC were in Baghdad when the bombing started, but they got kicked out on the second day and went back to London. And so I was in Jordan, so I was well placed to get a visa to go in when the Iraqis opened up again. So I went with Jeremy Bowen and a cameraman called Rory Peck, who was 2 years later, he was killed in Moscow. And the 3 of us drove into Baghdad from Jordan, up what was called Skardali, because once we were over the border in Iraq, we passed countless vehicles that had been bombed from the air in the previous couple of weeks. And we had to contend with the possibility that our convoy would also get bombed from the air. But we'd made it into Baghdad, and we were there to witness the nightly air raids, the nightly bombing, and the people's reaction to it. The hotel was a really interesting place. It was called the Hotel Al Rashid, and it had been built during the Iran-Iraq War, and it was a fortified building. It was designed to withstand heavy bombardment. It was bulletproof glass in all the windows, and so we didn't go to the bomb shelter. We stayed in our rooms. We were given rooms on the 5th or 6th floor, and we could watch from the 5th or 6th floor the city gradually being unpicked each night by these air raids. And it was early in the year, so it was dark early. And I remember these huge orange and black fireballs in the night sky as these very, very heavy bombs propelled by Tomahawk and other kinds of missiles slammed into the buildings around the hotel. There was a 6-lane highway outside the hotel, and on the other side of the 6-lane highway, there was some kind of conference center. But the rumor was it was somehow connected to the Ministry of Defense, and we were in the dining room of the hotel one night, and it took a direct hit, and our whole building shook. And I remember sitting, it was a surreal experience, because I remember sitting in the dining room being served dinner, and there was no electricity in the hotel. So the principal light source was the fire from the building across the 6-lane highway, which is now in flames. And the whole of the dining room was bathed in this kind of flickering, dappled orange light with shadows. And the waiters continued to serve dinner, and there was a row at the next table because some French journalists had brought their own wine, and the waiter wanted to charge corkage. And I thought, well, this is surreal. I didn't expect this. And that's how it was. It was a strange mixture of the very dramatic and the banal.
What else did you see while you were in Iraq?
I came back from Baghdad, and then Kuwait was liberated, and I went to Kuwait for a few weeks, and we went up into the deserts of southern Iraq and the mudflats of the Euphrates Valley, the part of the country that was occupied by the American-led forces. We reported on the uprising among the Shia population of southern Iraq and the reaction by the Saddam Hussein regime, which had been left in power, and he got his Republican Guard forces, the elite forces, together again and sent them down to the south to put down the rebellion very, very brutally, and thousands died in it. And we reported that, and then I went home and had a long rest. And then we started hearing news of unrest in what had been the most Western of the communist countries, Yugoslavia. Nobody expected Yugoslavia well, some people did. People who knew it thought it was doomed, but the rest of us didn't think so. And there was violence in Slovenia, in the republic at the north of the country, in Slovenia. And I was asked to go to Croatia for 2 weeks. And I drove down from Vienna, crossed the border into Slovenia and into Croatia, and got to Zagreb. And I stayed for 4 years, more or less. Not continually. I went in and out, but I went the next day. I went to the front line, just south of Zagreb, where Serb forces were pushing forward, and it was a very steep learning curve. Learning to understand the ethnic composition of this post-World War I state called Yugoslavia. And, it was a lot of reading, a lot of talking, a lot of listening. And I got to know it extremely well. And I spent quite a lot of time in Croatia in 1991. And then, of course, Bosnia in 1992, when the war kicked off there. And I remember in Croatia, people saying, this is bad enough, but if it takes off in Bosnia, that's going to be truly horrendous. And it was, really. There were 2 areas of operation principally. One was Sarajevo under siege, and the other one was central Bosnia, where there was eventually, after a few months, there was a war between 2 foot groups that had been, until that point, allies, the predominantly Muslim army of Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Croatian Defense Forces, and they fell out and attacked each other. So it became a 3-way war, with the Bosnian government trying to hold the line for the principle of a secular, non-ethnic republic in the mainstream European tradition, and the 2 other forces, Serb nationalist and Croatian nationalist forces, fighting for a very different vision, a much more ethno-supremacist vision. Many states in Bosnia carved out to be ethnically pure by the means that came to be known as ethnic cleansing. So we would report the siege of Sarajevo when we were there, the bombing, the sniping, the killing, the efforts to feed the city, the privations that the people were living through, and the attempts by the Bosnian government to seek international help. And outside Sarajevo, we'd go to the front lines and follow the progress of the so the forces behind the ethnic cleansing and the wholesale dispossession. And what was happening in the rest of Bosnia wasn't so much a civil war. It was an act of state-sponsored dispossession. It was a state-sponsored criminal enterprise. And the details of that are now well known because of the international tribunal that was set up after the war. It was hard navigating that, coming to understand all its nuances and understanding that the people of Croatia don't believe they're not part of the Balkans, they're part of Central Europe. And the Sava River and the Danube River separates them from the Balkans. And then one young man said, we were standing on the banks of the river, and he said, we're looking across the river at Bosnia or Serbia. And he said, where we are now on this bank, we're Central Europe, we're part of the same civilization and culture as, Mozart and the great German novelist Thomas Mann. And on the other side of the river, that's where all that Eastern way of thinking, that Asiatic way of thinking that leads all the way to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that starts over there. And that was very much the way many Croatian nationalists saw themselves, as the front line of the fight for European civilization against Eastern barbarism. Of course, it wasn't like that at all when you got to Bosnia. It was not the way Croatian nationalism depicted it, but it was important to understand those mindsets that were fueling so much of the violence.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.